Benvenuto all'ascolto di The Audio Journey, la newsletter dedicata all'industria del digital audio. Sono Mirko Lagonegro, CEO di MDE Audio Strategy, e in questa puntata incontro Bryan Barletta, founder e partner di Sounds Profitable. Sounds Profitable è un vero e proprio ecosistema multimediale composto da una newsletter, un podcast, attività di ricerca e tanto altro ancora, che ha un impegno assolutamente focalizzato sullo studio dell'evoluzione del business del podcasting. Proprio su questo tema e soprattutto sul tema dell'educazione nel podcasting, sul fare cultura, raggiungo Bryan a Sant'Antonio in Texas. Hi Bryan, it's a real pleasure having you on the audio journey.
Thank you for having me here.
Bryan, you started in digital audio with Barometric, the first attribution company in podcasting, as a founding member, and then in 2019 you joined with Megaphone. Why have you decided to work with audio?
So a lot of my background was always in advertising technology, and I really took a liking to it. I never considered myself a particularly creative person, but I was always excited by the ability to use my skill to help people monetize and grow their creative content. And so it started out in digital rich media, mostly mobile advertising. And through my career, I got to work at a lot of different places, but one of them happened to have an attribution solution, and their clients were WNYC and Progressive Auto Insurance. And it happened by chance. You know, everybody at that time was obsessed with podcasts already, but they were asking, could we track attribution in podcasting? And I always liked challenges like that, the areas where there is enough to do something, but it's new ground, right? Like nobody has explored it yet. And so I had the opportunity to be part of the team that kind of built that out. And it was the first time, like I had used a lot of mobile apps and mobile websites, but I wouldn't say it was like part of my personality or like the media I consume. I wouldn't describe it that way. But podcasts were just different. Podcasts were entertainment and education. And it was something that I was consuming probably a few hours a week at that point. So it just kind of took hold. It was the closest I could be to content that I consumed that I wanted to see more of. And it was the most effective I had been able to be in my career. So I kind of just dug deeper into it. And by focusing on it when a lot of other people hadn't, because connected TV and other areas really blossomed, I became an expert in that area, which made it easier to just keep doubling down in it. So I'm very thankful podcasting continued to thrive and continues to thrive now. Otherwise, I would have an expertise in a not favorable area.
Bryan, we are used to starting our conversation from the Italian podcast market to have from our international guests an external point of view. Well, according to the latest survey, the Italian podcast audience reaches 12 million people on a monthly basis, and half of them listen to podcasts daily or at least weekly. But at the same time, on a total Italian digital media market of almost 5 billion euro, the revenue of all digital audio supported by advertising is around 35 million euro, and podcast advertising contributes for a few of them, unfortunately. And if we talk about branded podcasts, the situation is similar, just another handful of millions. So it's evident there's a huge gap between listeners and value.
That is a huge gap.
Yeah. From your experience, how can we, let's say, solve or start to change these mindsettings in brand and agencies?
So I think that this is an area the US can help because we have the case studies, we have the examples of having gone through something similar, right? We have worked with advertisers who say, I just can't measure the same things I want to in podcasting, which is wrong. They can measure them and more. They say it's too new. I don't know enough about it. But we have success stories of these people moving their budgets from digital media, Facebook and Google and Twitter, right? Moving them from YouTube and connected TV in general into podcasting and find great success. And I think that we could provide those case studies and be more vocal in a way that would allow, I think, the world to kind of use that as examples to show to the advertisers you're dealing with about their peers who are spending a little bit more money and, the roadblocks they've hit, because there'll be similar issues there. I think that's one part of it. The other part is that it's persistence, right? Like it's really hard to say, continue making podcasts, continue pushing and showing the value and the culture there when you're not able to monetize it. But that's why I'm really keen on subscriptions. I think that podcasts that are built for a community of people become immensely powerful. Even if your podcast is completely free and doesn't have ads right now, there's an opportunity for you to measure that audience and survey them to understand who they are, their buying power, their interests, how much they want to learn more from you, and would they take product suggestions from you. That can be really fantastic. That becomes a baseline for a lot of podcasters, or even just the largest organizations of podcasters in Italy, to agree on those survey terms, because then you can collectively show how podcast listeners differ from non-podcast listeners, how they're tuned in, how they're open to purchase, how they might make more money, how they might be younger than other audiences that people are getting. Because I know in general, the audience in Italy is on the older end. So if podcasting appeals to a younger end, that's incredibly powerful. And those subscriptions too, right? Like, people get into the mindset that a subscription is always about an ad-free feed. Sometimes it's just about supporting the show. Sometimes it's extra content. Sometimes it's early content. There's no problem with adding ads down the line, even to the subscribers, if done tactfully. So you're never cutting yourself off. You're just making sure that you're set up for success. So yeah, I think it's using examples of where we've already tried this for other countries, and really showing that the audience cares about this. Live events, subscriptions, merch, those things that end up showing that this isn't just a segment of media, but it is mainstream. It is pop culture.
Bryan, according to your experience, are there other countries facing the same difficulties we are? And how do they succeed if they?
I think that looking at the US is a tough one, right? We are dominant on the advertising side. When I get the opportunity to talk to people on advertising, it's either US focused, very rarely like North America, right? Like the bleed in from Canada and Mexico doesn't happen as often as I would like, or it's global focused. I have a substantial number of partners that we work with that are worldwide, but they don't focus on their specific country or even continent. They focus on global, because the advertising dollars in those areas are more than just their country, right? The advertisers in Italy are open to all of Europe, are open to US inventory, because they have to think about that, whereas advertisers in the US don't. I think that the listener side of this whole thing has been growing year over year. I think it's very clear, especially to a younger audience, where podcasting fits in, that it is a mainstream medium for them. And not even podcasting, just transmission through audio on demand. So I don't want to limit that to an RSS feed. It can be in YouTube with the screen off. It can be a 30-minute audio file sent on on WeChat or whatever. There are a lot of ways that people are exploring audio, and it's becoming more and more popular because people aren't looking at their screens as much, or don't want to be. So what I can say is that when I look at other countries, I think that other countries are at a disadvantage because the revenue possibilities for them in their unique country are far smaller than the United States. And also the revenue, or the advertisers in those countries aren't thinking solely about that country. They're thinking globally. So the uphill battle to monetize outside the US is really strong, but the affinity for audio content outside of the US is actually stronger, right? The connection between spoken word, the history of often a government-supported radio as much as commercial-supported radio, those things make a big difference. And I would say that the momentum is visible there in the same way that it is 5 or 6 years ago in the US.
Bryan, sounds profitable goal is to educate and empower the podcast industry at all levels. Why do you think it's important to educate brands and agencies in order to grow the market?
It's so easy to make assumptions about what podcasting can and can't do, and that can cause a lot of frustration. I mean, the first 3 years of Sounds Profitable was really spent defending and explaining the download, our core metric, where a lot of people would say it's not that accurate. You can't confirm somebody listened to it. But there's so many great ways through attribution and measurement and surveys and brand lift that we can show effectiveness. We can even promo codes and vanity URLs can show effectiveness. And having worked in advertising for a lot of my life, there's social media, search and social both ran into these issues when they were new channels, right? We were used to being able to track impression and a click on a banner ad. We could tell if it was viewable and all of that. And then you enter Facebook and Google, who are there telling you, well, we're not going to fire an impression. We're only going to fire a click, and we're going to pre-validate the click. And so that, like, the strength there, that what we can do in podcasting, we can measure all these things, and we have the ways to match them into your entire media mix model. And I mean, heck, against broadcast television, broadcast radio, direct mail, out of home, we run circles around those. So educating buyers is really powerful, because if there's more money in podcasting, there can be more content created in podcasting, and creates a feedback loop, because that content can start taking more risks. And the more risks that it takes, the newer audiences and the more different audiences we attract on here. And the more we move away from advertising a podcast to advertising a show, like content that happens to be delivered in podcast format.
Bryan, speaking with brands and agencies, it seems that the lack of defined KPIs is the podcast's main problem. Every time we highlight that the podcast has its own KPIs, that even other media don't have the KPIs used in the digital world, I'm referring, for example, to the radio, whose business model is not affected by the lack of KPIs, well, it seems that this isn't enough for brands and agencies to change their minds about podcast KPIs. Well, what could be, in your opinion, the arguments with which respond to these objections effectively?
Well, I think, the KPIs and success in radio and broadcast seem to be focused less on conversion, right? US-based podcasting is heavy in direct-to-consumer advertisements, where we're trying to get someone to spend money, right? I put in $10,000 in ad campaign and I make $30,000. That's the success that you want. That's why Facebook was attractive and Google search was attractive, and all of these things, especially when there were zero interest loans, for people to just put in money and, like a slot machine, get out the 3x return. They figured out how to work that system. I think when we look at radio and broadcast, and again, especially outside the US, branding is way more powerful. And I think that branding tends to be a bigger part of the budget spent. So when you look at radio and television, and you look at the ability that they're not doing a unique promo code per station, or driving you to a unique website per station, or the host isn't reading the TV ad on there, it's a celebrity, or just an announcer, or a well-cut video, or well-cut audio. I think that the big difference in podcasting is showing the effectiveness, right? Showing that brand capability. There are podcasters that are celebrities that are too expensive to get to read your radio read, because they're not associated with radio, or your TV read, or anything like that, that are willing to do hands-on work in podcasting and have that influence, whether they're celebrities or just influencers. So what I really say on the KPIs there on branding, you get access to a top tier talent that you likely couldn't hire just for pure talent reads, because it wouldn't make budget sense. You can measure digital signals to tell branding better than you can do analog signals with broadcast television and radio. And the really challenging that, like, you don't have to stop at branding, right? You don't have to stop at brand advertising. Things aiming for conversion, driving towards specific results, seeing if you can get that audience to buy something or submit their information for follow-up is incredibly powerful. And anything that doesn't succeed on that is still branding. So that would be where I'd push back on the differences in KPIs.
Bryan, Sounds Profitable was recently joined by who, for me, is one of the brightest minds in the entire digital audio ecosystem, Tom Webster. Tom recently conducted a research on the podcast landscape, which, among other things, confirmed the effectiveness of the branded podcast. Unfortunately, I think there are still too many brands who prefer to be the interruption rather than be the message. May I ask you, what's your opinion about this?
I think we're going to see people push away from ads into segments, and from segments into mini episodes and mini series and full-blown branded podcasts. I think that we've seen some amazing success from branded podcast companies who've done, I think, almost the impossible, right? They've taken a core value of these brands And instead of advertising just the brand, they're advertising that vertical. Rocket Mortgage is talking about finance overall and where these things fit into your life, right? So that's one part of it. By arming those people with education and information and entertaining them, then you're putting yourself as basically the sole advertiser for that show. And it can be such a light touch by saying this episode is brought to you by, this segment is brought to you by, all of that, right? Because you're the only option. You're not competing with other ads in there, and you're educating that audience. They're the most leaned in people that you're going to get there. So I think that, there was a Cumulus podcast network, and Westwood One put out something related to the number of words in an ad read, in an audio ad read, and it should be less than it currently is. I think they said almost 10 words less than most people are doing. I think that that's a great place to start. If you really want to stick with ads, then you reduce them, right? This episode brought to you in part by Sounds Profitable. We're here to make sure that you're as educated as possible about podcasting. And that's why we recommend you listen to this show and check out our show, right? Period. The end. As quick as possible. But I think branded podcasts are going to boom because it's an asset. It's the ability to talk to a peer. It's the ability to educate. And you can cut that up for so many different things, for LinkedIn posts, social media posts. You can run those clips as ads elsewhere. So I think people are just opening their eyes up to how powerful it can be and how it's not really a 30-minute ad, but entertainment brought to you by a brand.
Yeah, I remember Tom telling to the audience of Give Your Brand a Voice, the Italian branded podcast yearly events, is a format known as through sponsorship, which in the end is a sort of gift.
Yeah. I mean, that's right. When it's not an ad, you don't have to sit through all that. You don't have to listen to 8 minutes of ads in a podcast and you say, this episode brought to you ad-free by Rocket Mortgage, right? That's got so much power. And you can do that because you paid for the content and you know the total value of it.
Bryan, I wish to talk with you a little about YouTube entering the podcast world, or vice versa is the same. I think the result will anyway be a turning point for the entire industry. What do you think will happen on the monetization side? I mean, on YouTube, you can publicly count the views. Will this help in selling podcasts?
I think the biggest challenge with YouTube right now and in video and podcasting is really that it's just YouTube, it feels like, because that's a destination that can monetize and that people are using and the search aspect is valuable. I think the big thing is that YouTube is really challenging if we're podcasters or we're creators, because I don't think that simply putting over your podcast with your cover art and a waveform is as compelling as we've been led to believe. So I think that when you go into video, you need to do more with it. But what you'll find is that there is a substantial amount of YouTube-focused advertisers who are incredibly skilled at driving performance and identifying performance over there. So I think that for most podcasters, it will open them up if they can grow that channel. And if they have a compelling enough product in YouTube, it will open them up for simulcast, both from podcasts into YouTube and YouTube into podcasts. It is not just 50% more work. It is absolutely double the work. It might as well be two separate pieces of content with how you're going to have to manage it, sell it, all of that. So I don't want to trivialize it anymore. And it's not as simply as putting it up there, but I think it has a great potential for the people who can buy into it to be a revenue path for them.
Bryan, thank you so much for your time and for joining to the audio journey.
Thank you for having me.
Questo numero della nostra newsletter termina qui. Se non l'hai già fatto, iscriviti alla nostra pagina e alla nostra newsletter su LinkedIn. Un saluto da Mirko Lagonegro.